So good evening, everybody, and welcome to 70 Cowcross Street. My name is Alan Kerwin. I'm the head of programs for the Association for Art History, and thank you all for coming out tonight and coming to this event. The Association for Art History, in case you've not ever heard of it before, and probably a lot of people haven't actually, we're the subject association for the topic in the UK. So very much an advocacy agency, really, for art history as a humanities discipline. So we'd work with the university sector, with government agencies, with charities, schools, to really promote it as an important humanities subject. Along with its sister subjects, history, geography, they would all have their associations. So this is the third night of our Art History Festival that we run every autumn. This is the second year that we've run it. And this year it's quite a monster of a festival. It's huge. It's happening all over the UK. It's happening at there's over 40 museums and galleries taking part across the United Kingdom, also in Scotland and Wales, with over 70 events. So it's great, and so it's lovely to see you all here tonight as part of it, actually. And the title of tonight's event, A Different Take on Art History, Perspectives from the Middle East and North Africa. And I have to say, I'd like to thank Amani Hassan, who's here from the Arab British Centre tonight, because they are collaborators and partners for this event this evening. And I suppose personally I felt it was a very important topic to have within an art history festival that we're running here in the UK, because we publish a journal that's quarterly, and if I'll have to remember the year I've written here, in 2020 we published a journal, and there was an essay within it called Decolonizing Art History. A very important, it's one of the most important publications that we've published, I think, as an association. And it was published by Catherine Grant and Dorothy Price, were the academics. And it really looked at, well, how do you decolonize art history? How do you talk about something that's seen from a very Western perspective? Art history, not plural. And we felt as part of the festival, it's time to open that up, which this essay did. Most of the academics who contributed to it said, actually, maybe we need to look at art history in other parts of the world and see how those stories are told. There's different ways of looking at art's histories and what artists have done in other regions and places. So that really informed tonight's agenda and what you're about to hear, and from the panel. And really introducing the panel, delighted that the three speakers can be here tonight, and introducing, first of all, looking from the far right across, is Najla El Ajeli. And Najla is an architect with over 20 years of experience in the profession. In 2012, she founded Noon Arts Projects, which some of you will know, I think, a private arts foundation, but with a specific mission to bring the best of contemporary Libyan art from both emerging and established artists and expose it to the world stage, which I think Najla really has effectively done. She collaborates with various cultural foundations and galleries. It's a really big part of her network of what she does. And she's curated over 20 projects and really successfully shed light on the current Libyan cultural and artistic scene, as well as the wider Middle Eastern North Africa region, I think it's fair to say. She's collaborated with the London-based Shubak Festival in 2015, and it's quite personal here, the Noor Festival, which I was very much part setting up in Leighton House Museum in Kensington, if you know it. So it was lovely to work with Najla on this. And really, I could go on. It's a huge, the Benetton Foundation, 2016, Italy, for the Imago Mundi Libya project. I would say another thing really to point out, since 2020, Najla has collaborating with the Silgar Buil Gallery in London as an independent curator, with exhibitions including Waves, a collective of 5 emerging North African artists, Soul Taming, for renowned and established Egyptian Nubian artist Fatih Hassan, who is really now an international superstar, and the Darna installation exhibition for the French-Moroccan street artist Combo. So it really is an extensive list of accolades, and we're delighted she's here. Sitting beside her is Ragad Mardani, and Ragad Mardani is the founding director of Lighthouse Gallery, and it's part of her ongoing commitment to showcase the work of contemporary Syrian artists and develop their market and really integrate them further into the international scene, very much like what Najla is doing with Libya. The gallery evolved from an art residency that Rajad had in 2012 in Beirut. to support Syrian artists who had fled to Lebanon and who were unable to continue their practice due to the trauma and financial hardship of their situations. So a really supportive endeavor that she set up. Lighthouse Gallery continues the work and ethos of the residency that she began in Lebanon by serving displaced Syrian artists. Rajat herself was born in Syria and initially trained as an engineer. That is her background, and has a civil engineering and master's in structural engineering from Damascus University. In 2008, she relocated to Lebanon, as I mentioned, but then in 2015 relocated here to the UK. And Rajat has a museum in Museums and Galleries in Contemporary Culture from Westminster University. Putting the questions to both Najla and Rajat will be Amy Dawson. And Amy is the acting digital editor at the Art Newspaper and co-producer of the Art Newspaper's podcast series. She's a specialist in art from the Middle East and North Africa, and really, I think, has published absolutely widely and really in depth on contemporary and past arts of North Africa and the Middle East. So without further ado, if you could give a big welcome to our three panelists, and I'll hand over to them.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. This is going to be a crash course in what is a very extensive history of art and culture, specifically Libya and Syria, but in the wider Middle East region. And what we're talking about here tonight, as Alan said, is actually it's a progression. This isn't, groundbreaking that we need to pluralize art history into art histories, that we no longer should be looking at a Western-focused canon that kind of ignores what other things might have been happening in the world. So this work is ongoing, and people have been talking about it for a long time, and we'll talk tonight a little bit about the specific kind of artists and movements from the countries that you specialize in, and there are parts, of course, that you can apply to other parts of the Middle East where schools and thoughts and movements were shared, but there are specificities as well within those countries, so we'll look at those. And as we go through our talk, in the background here we've got a selection of images that have been chosen, and we can talk more about those in depth at the end. There'll be 15 minutes or so for questions, so these will loop round and hopefully give you an idea of some of the visuals put to the artists and movements that we're talking about. So, the first question that I really wanted to ask is to dive in right at the beginning, because going way back to the start would be too much, as we talked about in our kind of pre-chat for this. And to look at what are the contemporary moments that really sparked interest in the kind of art scenes in the countries that you specialize in, or that you're from, and what were those moments that really kind of ignited a contemporary scene now, that really, when we were talking, we spoke very much about the 2011 uprisings in the Middle East, which I was living in Cairo at the time, and so spent a lot of time in Tahrir, and art was everywhere on the streets, and of course artists were working in depth long before 2011, but it just brought to the surface, you couldn't ignore it. So maybe Ragad, you could start by talking about what was the moment, or some of the moments that really, sparked contemporary art's interest.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Alan, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting us to speak here. Actually, the beginning of the 20th century was the renaissance of the Syrian art. It goes, of course, way before that, 7th millennium, before Christ. But the beginning of the 1900s was the time where there were galleries, exhibitions, and artist movement was quite vivid. Mostly it was Impressionism, and the art was around portraiture and landscape. Among these artists, the famous Abu Subhi Tinawi that did the story of Antar and Abla. And later on in the 40 until the 60, there was the Surrealism movement, and artists traveled to the West during the Ottoman period, which lasted for 400 years. And they had the first contact with the West and studied there and came back and were a bit influenced. In 2016 is the turning point where the Faculty of Fine Art was founded in Damascus. And until it went on until the 1990 and the last 4 decades were like the continuation of these movements and works. The artists moved to Expressionism, then they moved to abstract. And the turning point, the main turning point again, was the 2011 Arab Spring, where a lot of artists fled Syria to Lebanon. And that was the time of political unrest, diaspora. They lost their stability and they lost their studios and their practice. And that was the time where the idea of starting an art residency program in Lebanon to support these young artists came organically to me. And I started the Art Residence Alley, which was the first initiative to support young artists at that time. And it was home away from home. Artists spent 4 months, shared the space. We provided full board accommodation, material for work, and helped to showcase their works in Lebanon and worldwide. We even showed the work in the World Bank in Washington in 2014.
I think for so many people, those moments, kind of seeing on screen, like the media showing those really quite explosive political moments, were also social moments. And of course, they come supported by artists who give a visual to the kind of, you know, political expression that's happening on the streets. And it's incredible that you're able to support that. And maybe you could talk a little bit about Libya.
Libya is very different than Syria in terms of its arts movements. Libya is a huge country. It's the 4th largest country in Africa, very small population. It has its Roman legacy, its Greek legacy, its Berber legacy, Islamic and Ottoman legacy, and African legacy. In terms of the arts really, they were mainly like, you know, traditional kind of arts and crafts. And Libya, I was telling Alan earlier, always had traumatic kind of historical periods in its past for the last sort of more than 200 years. The Ottomans were there, and then the Italians came, and then the only time that somehow the artists started actually studying or some art came out from Libya was during the kingdoms period, which was when Libya gained its independence in 1951 up until 69. People were able to go and study the arts in Europe, in Italy. Most of the, I call them, I mean, you can count them on the fingers, like Ali Ghana, Bashir Hamouda, Omar Hermes. They all went to study outside of Libya to study fine arts. And then from 69 onwards, Libya was under dictatorship. The arts were oppressed. There was the University of Tripoli Fine Arts section was opened in the 70s. And some of these artists that studied outside, they started to teach the arts, and the interest started sort of to be ignited again. Also, we had very interesting, a lot of Iraqi artists came to Libya in the 80s and early 90s, and they taught at the Fine Art School in Tripoli. And most of the artists that are working now were trained under Iraqi artists. And the major sort of point, I say, that I myself personally realized that there is some interesting art coming out of Libya was after the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring. As you said, the streets were full of expression. Libyans were finally able to draw on the streets, paint, and a lot of the artists were actually working like crazy, like Yusuf Tes, Matuga Bourawi, Najla Shawkat. It was like a booming period for them, not only in the visual arts, but also music and poetry and literature. But as I said, in terms of major art movements, we had like in the 70s, the Arts Club, and that was founded by these artists that studied outside in the West. And then one of the most established space that they created was under Mustafa Ramadan, and it's called Art House, which still exists until today. But from now, the last sort of 10 years since the Arab Spring, things are really sort of promoted on a personal level, small grassroots movements. And a lot of younger artists are able to use social media to promote their work. And that opened, again, a sort of a floodgate of communications. And finally, some artists are able to go outside and show their work outside of Libya, and also to be exposed to what's going on and participate in art residencies or participate in exhibitions. So Libya is very different from Syria.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it, when you think, social media, as much as we talk about the ills of it, in society today, had such a big influence on the Arab Spring. I remember it was the first time I really sat up and paid attention to Twitter. There was so much interesting stuff coming from there, and of course you had to be careful about what was true and what was not, but it was, for a lot of people, the first time that they were really seeing kind of on-street reporting, live reporting from people, from artists, from creatives, and I think it was a very exciting time. Let's talk a little bit more about the important modern contemporary artists from your countries. So Ragad, do you want to go into a bit more detail?
Yes. As I said in the beginning of the 20th century, there was Michel Kerché, Tawfiq Tariq. And after that, I'll just count the most important ones because there are many. So Ilyas Zayyat, he quoted Khalil Gibran's sentence that his art is from the face of his mother and the face of motherland. So he's talking about the personal, about the national. And he also engaged in icons. So the original Aleppo icons were in the 17th century by an artist called Musawwar. And Ilyas Zayyat also followed that art. There is Lu'ay Kayali, who is from Aleppo, very famous artist. He depicted the mass migration from Palestine, and his famous painting, Then What, was shown in 1967. There was also Nazir Naba in his work. He showed details from the Massine homes and the details of women's clothes. So his work is very beautiful, detailed, with ornaments and colors. The most famous is Fatah Mudarris, who had more freedom on his paintings in expression, and his palette was from motherland soil. From the 60s and the 70s, I don't want to forget anyone. We said about Lu'ay Kayali. Yeah, there are also female artists like Layla Nasser and Chalabiya, but not as many as the Nasir Shora, Adham Ismail. So it was a big movement, and development, mainly on sculpture and paintings. Then later in the beginning of the 2000s, new young artists emerged, and we in Art Residence LA have worked with several young artists who are now displaced into Europe. So they found inspiration in the new geographies that they moved to and the cultures. So they are dispersed now. There are some who stayed in Syria, some in Lebanon, and mainly in Paris and Berlin. So you see a big community of artists. One of our success stories is Adel Dawood. He came from a small village in Qamishli in north of Syria. The first email he wrote was to me to apply for the art residency. And so we helped them to prepare a portfolio. We sent their work to other organizations and opened other opportunities for other art residencies. And now Adel lives in Vienna, and he shows his works in big museums worldwide, also in Vienna and Denmark. One of the also female artists is Iman Hasbani. She lives in Berlin, and she's a conceptual artist. Her work will be seen here on the screen, and she works on photo montage and talks about separation. So despite that they are now integrated into the new countries, all their work is still about identity and belonging.
I think that's definitely a theme that, you know, we talk about. Of course, there's big differences between Syria, Libya, and all the other countries too, but that is definitely, I think, something that really ties the region together. Like this idea of kind of home and identity is really important. I think probably because of so many traumas that have happened kind of in, you know, the last 100 years, a couple of 100 years.
That's very true. I mean, in Libya, one of the first artists, he's not very well known, but he went to, and he became quite famous in Turkey in the 1900s. He was a military soldier, Mohammed Laga, and he became involved in the Istanbul or the, you know, School of Arts. And then, I mean, really the most sort of important figures that I think for Libyan art were the people who studied in Rome in the 1960s and the 1970s, like Ali Ghana, who was a major kind of figure that sort of also did a lot for the University of Tripoli in terms of the fine arts and its architecture, and also saving the old Medina's heritage. And then you've got Ali Mustafa Ramadan. He's a sculptor as well. He studied in Rome and in Holland. And then we had Bashir Hamouda, who's still alive, and his work is quite influenced a lot by sort of the Italian Cubist period and abstraction period. His work is a lot about, when he was in Italy, it was quite sort of figurative, and he worked a lot on sort of studying the body and stuff like that. But then when he went back to Libya, his work became more about, as you said, the homeland, you know, social habits of Libyans. But you can see the Western kind of influence in his work. And then we have Ali Rumis, and I mean, he's, you know, a major calligraphist, not only for Libya, but he came here to the United Kingdom. And the influence of Islamic art and calligraphy. And so these sort of major figures that sort of, their influence in the Libyan art scene is quite important, and you can still see it in what other artists are producing now. And as I said, in the artists who came out in the 90s, who are now sort of, their work is becoming more sort of important, like Yusuf Tes, Najla Shawkat. Again, we have female artists now, and I think the Libyan female artists on the contemporary art scene are doing quite interesting work, and they're quite more braver in approaching difficult subjects than what the male counterparts are doing. Like Hadia Ghana, she is actually Ali Ghana's daughter. She's a ceramicist, but she does these incredible installations. She's half French, half Libyan, but lived all of her life in Libya. Her installations are, especially after the revolution, where she really talks about what's going on in Libya in terms of its society, in terms of its politics. And she does it really beautifully in a very new way of, it's not only, it's not, it's not painting or sculpture. It's actually, she creates these interactive installations where people are quite, they become involved in it. And some of her installations are not done, they're ongoing, so she keeps developing them, Another artist, young artist, who you can say she is the product of the revolution. She came, she was 15 or 13, Tiwa Barnusa, when the revolution happened. And she started her own kind of a grassroots foundation in Tripoli straight after she was very young, but she was quite, brave and active as well. And she was, and now she's working in Amsterdam. She left the country because of, the social kind of repression that's going on, and also Islamists really kept attacking her way of thinking and her way of art. But she also created Warak Foundation that worked a lot with the younger artists and what they're doing in Libya. And she managed to work with other foundations, like in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Berlin, where she had exhibitions and collaborations with them. So for the Libyan contemporary art scene, I think things are probably the next 10 years we will see more. Also artists in the diaspora, very well-known Libyan Canadian artist, Arwa Boon, who passed away in 2021. Her work again is about identity.
Yeah, we've talked in depth about lots of artists, and I think maybe if you don't know a lot about the region, it's quite overwhelming. But there are so many amazing artists, and hopefully you'll be able to take some names from here, and and we can talk about them more in depth in the questions. But one of the things that I wanted us to talk about is, it's obvious that there's such a vibrant scene and that there's such a long history of art and culture. What is the reason, or what are the reasons why these art histories haven't been taken into the canon, the Western art history? Why is it that so many people don't know about these? And I think, we know about Eurocentrism and these big textbooks that you get given at university that have kind of very defined abstraction happened, impressionism happened, and it all happened in this very linear fashion. I wanted us to talk about some of the really important institutions or exhibitions, symposiums, books, publications that have happened recently that are bringing these art histories to the fore, because I think that will give everyone kind of an idea of, places to start to learn more about these. And one that comes to mind for me, because of my time in Egypt, is the Surrealism in Egypt show that traveled, it was at Tate Liverpool, but it traveled around Europe, and I think it even went to the US. It was created by Sam and Till, Lebanese curators who are doing a really important job, I think, in bringing art history from the region to the fore. Can you think of more examples of, important moments that are kind of writing the history, putting it into the narrative today?
Yeah, there is a lack of art critics writings, and this is what gives,
in the region.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's huge gap in this, and there are some important books. I'm sure you know about Tharwat Akasha from Egypt. The famous book that was published by the Museum of Modern Arts, the Arab Contemporary History Art, which is edited by Annika Lenson. And that's talks about all the movements and of the modern Arab history
Rosa
of
Issa
art.
wrote a lot about
Yes.
Rosa Issa here in
She
London.
did a lot. She wrote,
Yeah.
I mean, she's actually focusing now on publications. And I think she is one of the first in London who started saying, hey, look,
Yeah.
there's something happening. We have art, you know.
Also, the British Museum has founded a department to collect
Art from the Middle
artworks, paper artworks from Syrian artists, and they showed a beautiful exhibition called Reflections.
Yeah,
At the,
that's
yeah,
from, the
and
Middle East and
some
North
of the
Africa.
artists that we are showing here were part of this exhibition. Also, there is in Paris Institut du Monde Arabe, the Arab Institute, and they do shows for Lebanese and Syrian artists. They did big shows. There was a very interesting initiative called Caravan Culturel Syrien, which was a bus that they carried the artworks from town to town in France, and they showed it in the street, in squares. That was one of the initiatives. Also, there is a Tassi Foundation in Dubai. They are doing archiving and digitizing of their artworks. They have a good collection. There is Etijahat. They're working on research and writings.
And so many of these initiatives are
mainly personal.
Yes, smaller.
most of them.
And a lot of them are maybe the last 10, 20 years.
10 years.
One,
really.
yeah, one that I was thinking of is the Bajil Foundation,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
I think
Yes.
is now 12 years old today. I think it's run by
It's a
Sultan
great,
Saud Al
Big
Qasimi.
collection, yeah.
Great
It's a
I mean,
very big collection, and they're
he
doing
does
a
look at the history.
Yes.
And he's beginning now to focus a lot also on North Africa, who is mainly the Levant. Really.
Yeah.
And now there is more interest in what's happening in Algeria and Morocco. Libya still, you know, again, because I think it's quite a difficult country for people to approach, especially with what's been happening in the last sort of 10 years post Gaddafi era, and before that.
I think this is one of the things as well that has stood in the way of kind of writing these art histories is, you know, a lack of access or, you know, political turmoils that have made things inaccessible. Archives that have been
Yes.
lost or, you know, you've not been able to get into, or like you say, lots of artists, lots of academics moving away and no longer having that connection to
Also the
country.
culture of how the Libyan public really looks at art is a very sort of, and patronage. We do not have a lot of Libyans who collect art. You know, only recently, you know, there are some important individuals who actually started collecting artworks from the other Arab world, like Abdelmajid Breish, one of them, who started collecting works by the Sudanese artist Saleh. He has a huge collection of his work from early on, and then he started getting into Libyan art just recently. Yes, Ibrahim Saleh, sorry. So there is a, I mean, the culture and of how to approach visual arts in Libya is not as, there isn't a lot of interaction between the public and the artists. But only recently, where we had also, like, first time we had a video festival that was open to the public, founded by the Areti Foundation in 2012, the Festival of Poetry as well. That was something that was amazing. That, you know, we had people coming from all over, from as far away as, you know, the States coming to Tripoli to participate in this poetry festival. And also there was some festivals in the Medina recently that was always closed. So there are some initiatives where the public is becoming much more aware of what artists are doing and to appreciate the arts more.
I think that institutional support within these countries is also can be quite lacking.
Exactly.
You know, when you look at museums within the countries, a lot of the time they'll be historic or archaeological. I'm thinking Egypt has a lot of ancient Egyptian art museums, but not very many modern and contemporary.
Yes.
And you know, this is certainly the case. Again, instability, political instability, also gets in the way of these kinds of things. But there is more and more happening within the region, and I think it is important that these conversations are happening not just here, but also, you know, that these countries are writing their own histories, or the regions writing their own art histories. And the institutional support is starting to appear in mostly in the Gulf.
Yes.
So we talked a bit about places like Qatar or the Emirates, where there is quite a bit more state support now. And one of the things that, so there's the Mathaf Museum in Doha in Qatar, and it's going to be a really interesting moment for them with the World Cup that's coming up. It's going to be a lot of people that probably would never have even gone to Qatar will now be seeing, they've got a very impressive array of museums there. So these kinds of things will kind of build up this knowledge of the region and its culture with the rest of the world and embed it into what we already know as art history.
I think also education, teaching art in these countries and how it's taught from very young age onto sort of university level and all of that. That also, in Libya, it's quite old, the way,
like traditional,
a bit archaic, very traditional,
traditional,
So that needs to be, and I think what younger artists are doing by themselves, creating these initiatives. Hadia Ghana, for instance, she's now opening her own first private museum, something that we've never had in Libya before. She's literally building the museum with her own hands for the last 4 years, working with volunteers, with artists, with students, with researchers, and she's also establishing some kind of an archival kind of database space as well in her museum. Which is something that is brilliant, and that Libya really needs this, and she's really focusing on doing that, because there's a lot to archive. There's a lot there's so much to do, and I think as I said, the next 10 years, watch it. You're going to see a lot of things coming out, and hopefully, if things are a bit stable.
But digital archives
yes,
always
digital,
helps.
Yeah, she's trying
for
to create
researchers.
A digital library.
Critics,
she is, which is very important, not only of the arts, but also the architecture of the old Medina, because things are disappearing.
And also
on a rapid stage.
Like old exhibitions that have happened, and articles
what's
about
been written,
things that have been, because like you say, when there's not so much art criticism, it's these are really important records to have.
And also to try, I'm trying to meet some of these artists who are still alive, because they were such a small group and they all knew each other. So it's so important to sit down and listen to them and hear their stories. One artist who I think is very important to Libyan art was Mohammed Abeya. His work is very, it's from the heart. And I think he's truly the only Libyan artist, because his art was really about Libya, where he used, he looked at poetry, Libyan folklore stories, his habitat, and he portrayed it in his work, and he developed his own kind of way of painting and of drawing. His sons are sort of holding on to his work, protecting it, and it's very difficult to get access to it. And the guy produced a lot of work. Luckily, before he died, he created a book of his work, and he wrote in it, and that's the only record that we have that we can actually go and look at and see.
I think, we have these structures, like in the West, that have been built over time, things like artists' estates, kind of these ways of protecting really important movements and artists within art history, that then there isn't necessarily that kind of structure already in the Middle East. And I think that it's partly this kind of diaspora that's emerging as people have been moving and maybe resettling, that those kinds of knowledges and those, that urgency to be able to preserve things will be taken back, and perhaps that this kind of industry will be built up. What do you think?
And there's a famous Syrian artist. His name is Marwan Kassabashi, and he moved to Berlin, and he was teaching at university there, and he has amazing artworks, like hundreds of artworks, and I think his family has done an estate of his artworks and archived it, and now it is lent to institutions to show all over the world. Yeah, so because he lived in the West and he knew how to approach this archiving and documenting, but others who don't have this access some works are not being given the right importance. But there's a pressing need to archive now, especially with a huge production, because there has been the past 10 years a lot of production in all sorts of art, as Najla said, also music, video art, literature. And there is a book that was published here in the UK called Syria Speaks, and it has a few excerpts from writing. It's a good collection of works. There's another also website called Creative Memory of the Syrian Revolution, and they have archived all the works, good and bad, of everything that has been produced after 2011. Which I think it's a huge effort.
Such a big job.
And now, like, the internet is the village of the world, so we are all connected on it, and people have access to these works.
Some artists, I mean, in Libya, like, they're doing it themselves, like Mohammed bin Lamin, who was actually a prisoner in the Abu Slim, and he was drawing on the walls before he came out. And he is trying to save all of his work by himself. He's a sculptor, he's a self-made artist, and he paints and he draws, multidisciplinary artist. He is trying to sort of put his work into some kind of, a database, which is brilliant when I see that. But he needs a lot of support, funding, and also just the technical side of things and how to do things. That's another thing. So for me, when I look for, information, it's a lot of work to because he also writes poetry. I mean, and most of his poetry is reflected in his art. So it's very difficult sometimes to just get hold of him, to listen to his poetry and to write it down and to see which piece of, art that he produced. So it's...
I think definitely you touched on art education, and I think that's really important. I remember, show my age, maybe 8 or so years ago, looking for a master's degree in Arab art, and it just didn't exist.
Yes.
Like, maybe there was one module you could take in America, and that was it. And now, I have so many people kind of approach me and asking me things like that, and there's so many. I mean, not just in Western institutions, but certainly, I ended up studying contemporary art and art theory of Africa and Asia, which comfortably kind of ignores the Middle East part, at SOAS here. And, none of the modules actually specifically focused on Middle Eastern modern and contemporary. You could look at ancient, or you could look at African contemporary. But now there's so many, and actually, again, Sultan Saud Al-Qasimi, he's traveling a lot and doing kind of professor stints at different universities and different cities in the world. But places like the New York University in Abu Dhabi, lots of other examples, and even like American University in Cairo, there are so many more programs now for modern and contemporary art.
Yeah.
And they, the people doing postgraduate research, those are the people who are doing the archiving, writing these histories, producing the books. And like you say, in the next decades, I think you will start to see the fruit of that.
Material will come.
Yeah, exactly.
I was a visiting lecturer at Virginia University in America in a course called Aesthetics of Trauma. and it was taught by Hanadi Al-Samman. It was very interesting. I spoke about the project in Art Residence LA, and it was like one of the great experiences that I had. Yeah, we did it over Skype, but like meeting the students, listening to their questions, and their curiosity and their wanting to know more about modern art in the Middle East, and the works of Tamam Azam, the famous painting of Klimt that he imposed over a rubbled building. This went viral. It's aesthetics of trauma. It's like we're talking about destruction, about death, but in the same time there is the hope in the colors of the master. It was part of the series called Syrian Museum, and it was very, very interesting.
Talking about artists who created beauty out of trauma, we have a very well-known Libyan artist. He was, again, self-made sculptor, Ali Al-Wakwak from Benghazi. He created these sculptures after the revolution and during the revolution of scrap metal and bullets and huge sculptures. And his work was exhibited in 2015, all of the work, at the Museum of Rome, and it's still there. He passed away in 2016. I think he sold all the work to them. It's good, but it's also sad because most of his work was exhibited in Benghazi on site, in the city around, you know, and now it's gone. Where it belonged, and now it's gone. Now it's in Rome, and nobody can access it. That's another problem because he died, and nobody knows, you know, what happened to this huge legacy that he left behind. So there are these, it's quite.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to wrap up. I mean, we started a little late, so I think we'll end here, and if you guys have some questions, there'll be a microphone. I'm so glad that we got to talk about this. I think that we'll be seeing a lot more about Arab art histories, Middle Eastern art histories, North African art histories, and specific countries too. And again, this is one region of art histories, but this kind of decolonialism that we talked about needs to happen in so many parts of the world for art history. So thank you all so much, and if you guys have any questions, please don't be shy. Otherwise we'll continue to natter amongst ourselves. Anyone have anything over here?
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for this really insightful conversation. It's also really nice to be having these in person and actually being in a room and hearing you all speak. I'll try to keep this short, but I'm kind of we touched upon this briefly, but if we look at the word art history and, you know, consider the context of art history as a discipline, and I'm also thinking of a little bit of what was mentioned in the journal on decolonizing art history, and how art history as a discipline seems very rooted in the English language, firstly, and within Western-centric knowledge systems and structures. And I think in context of that, I would love to know a little more about the vernacular art histories. So what about art histories, whether it's in Libya or in Syria, that are in local languages and have not yet been translated? Do we need to translate them? Is that important? Is it important to be recognized in the English language? Is it important to be recognized in the West for it to become an art history, and just kind of how that links to decolonization and how that links to our idea of what decolonization is in the first place?
That's a
Thank
fantastic question. I think it sounds like a dissertation. I mean, I'll just speak with my kind of first reactions, and then you guys can weigh in. One of the things that was fascinating for me when I studied Arabic before I studied art, and a lot of the time when you're trying to talk really in depth about art, there aren't words necessarily for what you want to say in the Arabic language, and I would end up, you know, speaking in Arabic and dropping in English words to explain things. So even like words for display, like certain kinds of displays, I think that maybe often we have kind of created art history from an English language standpoint. It is almost like a Western product. But does that mean that it should stay that way? I don't think so. It needs to be broken down. And I think that, do we need it to be in English language? Well, we're all here today speaking in English and listening in English. And I mean, that's a whole colonial question in itself. But, you know, this is the way that we are able to communicate with one another. And so I think it is important to have these conversations in English and to be able to have this access in English, but it's very important that these things are also available in Arabic. You cannot close out the people that these histories are born of, you know? And so lots of these databases that are now appearing online are bilingual, if not more languages than that.
Arabic is such a rich language.
And diverse
it has
in different countries.
Different words for each meaning. Maybe as a foreign speaker, you just didn't know the words. But yes, there are writings in Arabic, like the art historian Afif Bahnasi from Syria. He wrote several books, and here comes the importance of translation also. So maybe these books were not translated into other languages, so you don't know about it, but they do exist. But there is also shortage on that, yeah. Especially recent, I'm speaking about recent production of art and the need to write about it and in English. I just want to mention our recent exhibition in the summer. It was called Velvet Society, Power and Glamour in 90s Damascus. So I revisited the 90s where I lived in Syria. I had photos, videos, and even the dresses that we wore during the 90s. I brought them all here, and they were showed parallel to the artworks of Hiba Al-Akkad. And we commissioned an essay by Professor Janice Jeffries, an academic from Goldsmiths, to write about the exhibition. So we could be able to reach the audiences and the Western art viewers and art interests. Yes, the essay gave a lot of importance to the very emotional show that Nazla was present also with us.
Did you translate that into Arabic, or did it just exist in English?
Yes, so Professor Janice Jeffries' essay is only in English. Yeah,
Time to translate.
I know, that's a good point.
For me, I've had very interesting experiences because Libyans speak Arabic mainly, and it's quite they get very upset when things are not written in Arabic. So I did my second exhibition was in Libya, and it was a collective of 13 artists in Tripoli, straight after the revolution. And for me to pick a title in Arabic, I used the word Hadr Zamansiya, which means forgotten chatter. And that's the Libyan colloquial, it's the local language. And they loved it because I didn't even make it into classical Arabic. I used the Libyan phrase for the exhibition, and it was a collective of artists from all over Libya. And it was the first time that something like that was done in Tripoli. And it wasn't only of established sort of known artists, but it was a collective of artists, emerging artists and established artists. And it was mixed media. It was photographs, it was installations, it was paintings. And one of the most sort of interesting pieces, I'm going to talk about it again, it was a piece that was an installation piece that was done by Hadia Ghana, and she used the word zarda, which means picnic in Libyan. And the word, and this installation, she created all these ceramics, and it's about having what a picnic is to Libyans, but she was talking about what was happening after the revolution. So she created like this, created this rug made out of calligraphy, and what was written on it was, and the names of martyrs, the blood of martyrs will not go it will not fade. And it was a slogan that was used during the revolution. But she used chalk because it was suddenly Libya wasn't it wasn't as people wanted it to be. And she created these ceramics like of rubbish, like crushed cans, plastic, bags, but was all made of ceramics with images of the people who died in the revolution, of images who went missing. And she just put it down there. And people, Libyans themselves, they didn't understand it at first. And then when they looked at it, they related to it so much because and she wanted them to pick up the pieces. So they were like picking up these like crushed cans and looking at the images, and the word Shaheed, which means martyr, was written on it, and how it was just disposed of and thrown away. So this piece, for me, and as I said, Hadi is very clever because she really used somehow the Libyan language to portray her message. And this piece has been shown all over the world. And it's one of the most successful pieces, I think, that came out from Libya, really about Libya itself. And she succeeded in sort of portraying her viewpoint and of what's going on and what she feels. So,
It's such a complex question, but I definitely think, I think we'd probably all agree that, bilingual is important.
And how to
being able to speak to the translation.
Arabic is very difficult to translate and how to do it justice. I worked with the artist Fathi Hassan, who is Egyptian Nubian artist, and he writes a lot in Arabic. And he speaks Italian, and he just moved to the UK in the last 3 years, and he had a big exhibition at Sol Gabwell. So they asked me to go and help them because, he writes and then he paints, and he uses a lot of his Nubian heritage in his work, and a lot of Arabic and Nubian sort of diagrams and stuff like that. So for me, when I open a conversation with him, he just speaks to me in Arabic, in Egyptian. And I always say, Fathi, just write down, and these beautiful pieces that he writes. And I try to translate them to English in order to translate his message to the gallerist or to people. So it's quite a difficult, kind of a bridging that you find yourself in. But the art does it, and then when people see his huge, beautiful tapestries, they just understand what, they get drawn into it. So it's an interesting question. But it's difficult, when you're in the middle and you're trying to sort of work as a bridge in between, two kind of cultures.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the fascinating discussion. My question is about the post-war, post-colonial moment of the 50s and 60s and alternative spheres of influence. And I'm thinking about the non-aligned movement, for example, 1961 or the Bandung Conference. So countries such as India, for example, or links to Mexico and the significance of the Mexican muralists, Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros visited Egypt in the 50s, for example. Also links to the Soviet Union, so something that alternatives to the West. And to what extent do those links with, let's say, Mexico or the former Soviet countries, or let's say India or other non-aligned countries, remain now and also remained from kind of the 70s onwards? So it's a big question. So
it's a very important question because in Libya, definitely the influence of sort of Eastern European art and architecture was very influential in what was going on in Libya. A lot of architecture We had a lot of architects who built major socialist buildings in Libya, were commissioned by the Gaddafi regime from Czechoslovakia, from Yugoslavia. And then in terms of the visual arts, as I said, a lot of artists who taught at the University of Tripoli were Iraqis who trained in Russia. A lot of them trained in Russia or Eastern Germany. And, you know, and their influence on what some Libyan artists is quite, you can see it in their work and their way of thinking. So that is, it's there. Also, we have the artist, what's his name, Tahir al-Mughrabi. His work was influenced a lot by the Mexican artist, Diego Rivera, and it's quite, and how he used sort of socialist kind of, you know, what was happening in the Libyan society in the 80s, you know, when Libya was bombed by the Americans in 1986. He produced a huge amount of work depicting what was going on in Libya. There was also a lot of propaganda artists in Libya that were working, you know, and what they were producing in terms of visual arts. So.
I would just say that definitely from kind of, you know, kind of an art industry perspective, looking like I travel quite a bit to the Emirates, they definitely are thinking more and more about their kind of like South Asian connections, and places like Art Dubai are less aligning themselves with the West and more looking to those regional neighbors and creating a community there. So you do see a lot more shows and gallery representation from like Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and also foundations that are open, like Shara, which is looking at kind of Southeast Asian art or South Asian art. And I think that certainly, you know, those connections are getting stronger. I mean, what do you think, Raghad? Do you have?
Well, Syria had strong connections with the Soviet Union, and a lot of artists studied there. So how much they were influenced, I'm not sure, but I know that they definitely lived in Russia for a while. Also, a lot of artists went to Istanbul during the Ottoman time, and that was, so they are influenced by Islamic art, geometric, colorful lines.
And there's so today, do you think that connection still stands today, or?
It's more like modernized influences into a more contemporary, but we cannot deny the past, you know, it
feeds the future.
Yeah, it feeds the present, definitely. Yes, also, there was the Umayyad, there was the Abbasid, there was, so Damascus was the capital of the world at a certain time during the Arab Empire.
Yeah.
So Damascus, there is the Al-Azm Palace that was built on the 18th century, has amazing artworks until today. And and it's very important to preserve those works and also preserve the objects in the museums and stop, you know, being looted and stolen from our land.
Yes. This is a very serious issue, for sure. We've got time for one more question, and then, you know, we'll have some drinks and things, and you can, you know, corner the speakers for any more specific questions after that.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. First of all, it's really interesting topic. First, I would like to say, I don't know if it's really relevant, but the art residency, as a young Syrian artist, graduated at the beginning of the war. That was really inspirational. I've never joined, but to see all my young classmates like Muhammad Amran, Fadi Hamwi, etc., they were there in a time that we were really trying to find anything, you know. It was really interesting and gives a lot of hope. Now, thanks a lot. Now, to go to the question, I think, is more about contemporary and future a little bit. So, absolutely, a lot of Syrian artists have scattered and been around the world because of the war. Now, the good part, the good side, is they are still producing art. But do you have any concern or thoughts about, by the time of losing identity and authenticity of their practice, where they're coming from, to be more merged with the new life, which is not a problem, but also would it be a concern, or you think they will always refer back to where they came from? Just a thought. Thank you.
Well, a very good question, and thank you for the tribute. Mohammed Amran and Fadi Hamwi, they were like dear friends also to me, and their work is, they continue producing art, as you said. Like, let's study some of the artists who went to the West, like Muhammad, like Adil Dawood that I just mentioned. They didn't lose their authenticity. I think it's so much embedded in us, you know, this culture. It's in our blood. I have been living outside Syria for 14 years, but I still, you know, I'm still the same person. A little bit, of course, I'm a hybrid now person, because I also integrated in the British society, the language that we speak every day. But I think it's not a bad thing, you know, to get new influences from other cultures and produce something completely new. We don't want also to be stuck in the past, and we want to develop and also walk with new civilizations and new cultures and new trends in the world. So I think it's a good thing that they get influenced, so they produce something very special, because they will never lose their heritage.
I think you only have to look at kind of the Palestinian diaspora to see that, you know, I think if anything, it seems to strengthen a lot of the time your ties.
I think they become their own individuals as well. I mean, when an artist, I mean, I have Arwa Bouhoun, she's Canadian-Libyan artist. Her work is always about her identity, but she's also presenting her Western identity, you know. She's not saying, you know, this is her Muslim, Western, and Libyan identity. So they're always there in her photography and how she composes her work, and what elements she chose to portray in her work. You know, I'm like this image of her mom, you know, eating a watermelon. It's you know, it's like Western at the same time, but it's, you know, her mom is with her hijab and eating a watermelon. And there's another one of, you know, she calls it, what is it, weapons of mass discussion. And this amazing image of her and her mom trying to put on their hijab, you know. And so it's, I think each artist, it's where his context or her context is going to play a lot into what they produce. And yes, their original kind of, you know, identity will always come out, but it's always what sort of what you're part of. I mean, I am hybrid as well. I've been living here for a longer time than Maghreb. I've lived in Italy. I've lived in the States. But my parents were Libyan, and I go back. I married a Libyan. You know, it's part of me. But at the same time, so is Britain, so is Italy, so is America. It's all part of me, and you have to come to a point where you, I don't know, the older you become, the more sort of you just you have to accept who you are as you are, you know, with all these different kind of layers to your personality. And I think artists do that.
Thank goodness for hybrid artists, and let's hope for a more hybrid art history going forward that represents them. Thank you guys so much, and I want to thank obviously my lovely panel and the Association of Art History and the Arab British Centre, and I hope you guys will all enjoy the rest of the festival. It goes on till the 26th. Thank you all very much.